New York City, in the winter of 2005, carried a kind of heavy silence beneath the roar of traffic and the hum of neon signs. A silence that revealed itself not in the bustling avenues of Midtown or the shining storefronts of Fifth Avenue, but in the shadows of the Bowery, where the streets were littered with forgotten coats, cardboard beds, and faces that people avoided out of habit rather than crew. LTI, and where one particular public shelter stood like a weary sentinel of lives that had slipped through the cracks. Inside that shelter, with its peeling paint, the sour smell of old coffee, and the restless shuffle of men seeking warmth more than rest, lived a man the others called simply Stan, though no one seemed to know if that was his real name, and truth be told, few cared enough to ask. He was a man of silence, with a raspy voice he rarely used, eyes that seemed fixed on something far beyond the dingy walls around him, and a presence so withdrawn that he often appeared more like a shadow than a person. During the day, he sat by the window with a chipped mug of tea, saying little, nodding only when spoken to, but at night, when the lights dimmed and the shelter fell into that uneasy quiet of half-sleep, something remarkable happened. Then, and only then, he began to hum. It was not the absent-minded humming of an old man drifting through scraps of memory, nor the tuneless muttering of someone lost in madness. It was deliberate, steady, and filled with a weight that no one else seemed to notice. A melody that floated low through the cold air, almost too faint to hear, but once heard, impossible to forget. Most men rolled over in their bunks, indifferent or annoyed, but one young volunteer stopped in his tracks the first night he truly listened. Michael Carter, 22 years old, a history major at NYU with more curiosity than certainty about where life might take him, had grown up hearing stories of his grandfather who had fought in Europe. And when he caught the thread of that tune, something stirred in him, a recognition he couldn't shake. It wasn't a folk song, wasn't a hymn, wasn't jazz or blues. It was something older, something carried by soldiers through the mud and the rubble of a faraway land. He knew it from a recording he had once studied in a course on wartime culture. The Red Poppies of Monte Cassino, a song first sung by Polish troops but adopted as a haunting emblem of sacrifice across the Allied lines in Italy. Why was this broken, forgotten man in a Bowery shelter humming that song? What thread bound him to that battlefield, to that melody that echoed across generations? Michael knew, in that instant, that this was no coincidence, no idle habit. This was a key, a secret, waiting for someone to turn the lock, and so he decided to ask. If this story touches you the way it touched me while writing it, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, prepare yourself, because what comes next changes everything. Michael had spent several evenings building up the courage to ask. And yet, when the moment finally came, it wasn't the carefully rehearsed question he had imagined, but something impulsive and raw, spoken as he set down a bowl of soup in front of the old man in the cafeteria of the Bowery shelter and leaned closer with quiet resolve. "That song you hum, it's Monte Cassino, isn't it?" For the briefest instant, the man's tired eyes widened, a spark of recognition or perhaps fear flashing across them, before the lids lowered again and the expression hardened into something unreadable. His lips moved with a dry murmur, rough and uncertain. "I don't know what I hum," and he turned away, as though he might bury the question in the shadows of the corner he occupied. But Michael didn't give up. He returned the next night with tea, strong and sweet, another time with a paperback history book left casually on the table, open to photographs of young soldiers in Italy. And sometimes he brought nothing at all, only his presence, sitting nearby without pressing, letting the silence stretch between them like a fragile bridge. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the old man's resistance softened, and then, on a damp evening in late March, he set down his spoon, folded his hands, and spoke with a voice that trembled as though the words had been locked inside him for half a century. "It wasn't always like this. I had a name, I had a home, I wore a uniform. His name was not Stan, it was Stanley Bernard. Born in 1922 in Buffalo, New York, the son of a steelworker and a schoolteacher, he grew up in a house where duty, sacrifice, and faith were spoken of as naturally as bread on the table. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, he was 19 years old, full of anger and restless courage, and he enlisted in the U.S. Army without hesitation. Assigned to the 34th Infantry Division, the Red Bulls, he was shipped first to North Africa, then to the long, punishing Italian campaign, where the hills and valleys became graveyards for thousands. He spoke haltingly at first, but once the words began to flow, Michael could see the floodgates opening. Stanley told him of the endless mud, the mountains that swallowed men whole, the sound of artillery that never ceased, and he told him of Monte Cassino, that brutal fortress of stone and fire, where men from every corner of the Allied world were thrown against the walls of a centuries-old monastery. The ground was red, he whispered, not from poppies, but from blood. And still, we kept moving forward singing. For Stanley, the Song of Monte Cassino was not just a melody, not just a memory. It was a vow. He had made it one cold night with his closest friend, Walter, another kid from upstate New York. They had sat together behind a crumbled wall, sharing a cigarette, speaking of home and futures that felt impossibly distant. Walter had said, "If one of us doesn't make it, the other has to keep singing this song, so they'll never be forgotten." The next morning, Walter was gone, killed by a mortar round, and from that day forward, every hum of that tune was Stanley's promise kept. His way of carrying his friend with him through the years. The war gave him other scars as well. Near Bologna, in the spring of 1945, he was wounded by shrapnel, his leg torn, his shoulder burned, and he spent weeks in a field hospital. It was there that he met Judith, a nurse from Chicago, whose gentle hands and tired smile gave him the only moments of peace he remembered from that time. They spoke in hushed tones between bandage changes, shared stories of their families, and once, in a rare afternoon of calm, walked together under the crumbling arches of a ruined Italian church. It was not a grand romance, not in the ordinary sense, but something born of fire and silence, a fragile hope that perhaps life could exist after war. Before he was shipped home, they exchanged addresses, promising to write. But when Stanley returned in 1947, the country he found was not the one he had left. The parades were over, the banners gone. Veterans flooded the streets, thousands struggling to find work, to fit back into homes that no longer felt like theirs. He applied for jobs, was hired and dismissed, moved from place to place, never quite able to settle. Letters he sent to Judith came back unopened, stamped, returned to sender. Friends drifted away, family ties frayed, and slowly, painfully, he slipped through the cracks. By the 1960s, he was working odd jobs, night shifts as a security guard, janitorial work in office buildings. By the 1980s, he had lost almost everything. And by the time the century turned, he was just another shadow among the forgotten, a man with no papers, no possessions, no voice, except for the song, always the song. "When I hum," he told Michael one night, staring out the window at the blurred lights of passing cars, "for a moment I'm myself again. I see Walter's face, I hear her laughter. I remember that I was more than a number in a shelter." Michael sat in silence, absorbing every word, every pause, feeling that he was not sitting beside a homeless man, but beside a monument in flesh and bone, a witness to something his textbooks had only hinted at. And he realized then that this was not just one man's broken memory. This was history itself, waiting to be heard, waiting to be carried forward, and he knew that from now on, listening was no longer enough. There were nights in the Bowery shelter when Stanley's humming was so faint it could almost be mistaken for the rattling of the old pipes or the muffled shuffle of boots across the linoleum floor. And yet, for Michael, who had trained himself to listen with an attentiveness that bordered on reverence, those fragile notes carried more weight than any speech, for they were not simply the absent mind. It sounds of an aging man drifting in and out of memory, but the deliberate rhythm of a vow, a ritual repeated again and again, because silence would have been unbearable. When Michael asked him why he sang it, why always the same tune, Stanley didn't hesitate, didn't smile, didn't soften the edges of the truth, but instead turned his gaze to some faraway point that only he could see, and answered with a simplicity that struck like a hammer, "Because I promised, because if I stop, then they're gone." The red poppies of Monte Cassino had become his lifeline, his tether to the men who never returned, most of all to Walter, whose face appeared to him as vividly now as it had on the morning he fell. But the song was more than that. Over the years, it had absorbed other voices, other memories, until it carried within its fragile melody not just the echo of fallen comrades, but the presence of a woman whose name he spoke rarely and whose absence had shaped his silence more than any wound ever could. Her name was Judith. In the field hospital near Bologna, when he was half conscious from morphine and blood loss, she had leaned over his bed with steady hands and whispered to him not to give up. She was not much older than he was, perhaps 24, with hair pinned tightly beneath her nurse's cap and eyes that, even in the haze of exhaustion, held the kind of warmth that could silence fear. He remembered how she touched his bandaged shoulder with the care of someone who had seen too many men slip away and refused to let him be one of them. They never called it love. How could they, when death pressed in from every side? But it was there in the stolen glances, in the way she lingered a second longer than necessary when changing his dressings, in the hushed conversations about home, hers in Chicago, his in Buffalo, about trains they would ride and streets they would walk if the war ever ended. One afternoon, when the guns fell silent for a rare moment, they walked together beneath the shattered arches of a bombed-out church, and he remembered thinking that nothing so ruined could ever feel so holy. Before he was shipped out, they exchanged addresses, scribbled quickly, almost desperately on scraps of paper. She had pressed hers into his hand with a look that was both hope and fear. And then she was gone, swallowed by the endless churn of the war. When he returned to America, he wrote to her once, twice, a dozen times. The letters came back unopened, stamped return to sender. At first he believed it was some clerical error, then that she had moved, then that she had married. Eventually he stopped believing anything, but he never stopped humming the song. Because when he hummed it, she was with him again. Michael listened to all of this in silence, the kind of silence that comes not from lack of words but from awe, from the recognition that what he was hearing was not simply memory, but living history, fragile and burning in front of him. And he began to understand that the song itself was more than a remembrance. It was a shield. "When I sing," Stanley said one night, his voice barely audible over the hum of the radiator, "the faces don't come back. Not all of them. The song keeps them in their place. It gives them rest. If I stop, they return, and they don't let me sleep." Michael realized then that the melody was not just a reminder, but a survival mechanism. It was the only way Stanley could keep the flood of ghosts at bay, the only way he could keep himself tethered to the present. Without it, the memories would consume him. One night, Michael brought a small recorder and placed it gently on the table. "Will you sing it for me?" he asked. "All the way through. I want to remember your voice." Stanley looked at him for a long time, his eyes narrowing as if weighing whether the boy understood what he was asking. Finally, he shook his head and whispered, "You don't sing the whole song unless everyone comes back." But later that night, when the snow fell thick outside the windows and the shelter lay in uneasy silence, he began. The notes were shaky at first, but then they steadied, growing stronger, carrying through the room like a prayer spoken not to God, but to memory itself. And though his voice cracked, though the words caught in his throat, there was a dignity to it that silenced even the most restless men in their bunks. Michael sat frozen, hardly daring to breathe, knowing he was not merely hearing a song, but receiving a testament. Every word was a gravestone, every note a heartbeat from another time. And when the song ended, Stanley closed his eyes and said simply, "Now you know." From that night on, The melody was no longer just his. It had passed into Michael's keeping, a legacy entrusted, a flame carried forward, because in the end, Stanley Bernard wasn't humming to soothe himself. He was singing to make sure the world didn't forget. For Michael, what had begun as the faint hum of an old man in a shelter had already become something far greater than a curiosity, far greater than an act of kindness performed by a student volunteer. It had become a responsibility, a weight that pressed upon him with each story Stanley entrusted to him. For in those halting words and that fragile song, he could hear not only the personal grief of one man, but the echo of an entire generation that had slipped quietly into invisibility. Back in his cramped NYU dorm room, surrounded by books, photocopied articles, and the glow of his laptop, Michael often stayed awake until dawn, replaying the recordings he had made, typing out transcripts, searching for a way to preserve what he had been given so that it would not vanish the moment Stanley's voice fell silent. He knew he could not keep it to himself. So one night, with the restless energy of someone who senses that the ordinary has just crossed into the extraordinary, he created a simple blog. No design, no banners, just black words on a white screen. He called it Forgotten Heroes. His first entry was plain, almost stark in its simplicity. In a shelter on the Bowery, he wrote, lives a man who fought in Italy in 1944. His name is Stanley Bernard. Every night he hums the song of Monte Cassino. This is his story. He included a short excerpt from the recording, just a few trembling lines of the melody, and a photograph of the shelter's peeling wall, because there was no photograph of Stanley he dared to post. Not yet. He went to bed thinking no one would read it. But when he checked the site the next morning, the view count was already climbing. By the end of the week, the post had been shared dozens of times. Comments began to appear. From history students who had never heard of American troops singing alongside Poles, from teachers who wanted to print the story for their classes, from veterans' families who said it sounded just like their fathers or uncles who had never spoken of the war, but sometimes hummed in the dark. And then came the email. It arrived with the subject line, "My grandmother's box." The sender was Anna Wilson, an art historian in Chicago. She explained that her grandmother, Judith Wilson, had passed away 3 years earlier. In going through her belongings, Anna had discovered a small wooden box filled with mementos from the war. Pressed flowers, photographs, letters, scraps of fabric. Among them was an unopened letter addressed to Stanley Bernard Buffalo, NY, 1945. The envelope bore the stamp returned to sender. Michael's hands shook as he read. Anna wrote that she had stumbled on his blog by accident, recognized the name, and wanted to know if the man in his story was the same Stanley her grandmother had spoken of in whispers, but never fully explained. She attached a scanned photograph. A young soldier in uniform, standing beside a nurse in white, the two of them holding hands under the shade of an Italian olive tree, looking at the camera with a mixture of hope and dread. When Michael printed the photo and brought it to the shelter, Stanley stared at it for so long that Michael wondered if he had heard him at all. Then slowly, with a trembling finger, he traced the outline of the nurse's face as though touching her would make her real again, and his eyes filled with tears. "That's her," he whispered. "That's Judith. She never changed in my memory, not once." Michael told him about the letter, about the box, about the granddaughter who wanted to share her grandmother's story with him. For a long while, Stanley said nothing. Finally, in a voice cracked but steady, he murmured, "Then I didn't sing in vain." She remembered. From that night on, his humming shifted. It was no longer just a dirge for the fallen, no longer just a shield against the faces of the dead. There was gratitude now, a quiet peace that had never been there before, as though the song no longer belonged only to him, but was a bridge between two lives that had once touched and had somehow, across the decades, found each other again. Michael wrote about all of it on the blog, the photograph, the unopened letter, the connection that spanned 60 years. The post spread faster than the first, carried across forums, shared in classrooms, picked up by small newspapers, and eventually national outlets. More comments poured in. Sons and daughters of veterans wrote about similar fragments of memory. Teachers organized projects to collect their community's stories, and strangers thanked Michael for reminding them that history was not just dates in a book, but the trembling voice of a man in a shelter. Then the phone rang. It was a representative from a national veterans organization. They wanted to invite Stanley to a Memorial Day ceremony at Arlington, not to award him medals, not to put him on display, but to let him sing his song, to let his voice carry for all those who no longer could. At first, Stanley refused. "I don't want a stage," he muttered. "I don't need applause. I don't need anyone's pity." But Michael leaned forward, met his eyes, and said, "It's not for you, Stan. It's for Walter, for Judith, for all the ones who never came home. If you sing for them." For a long time, Stanley was silent. Then he nodded, slowly, as though laying down a burden he had carried alone for far too many years. And Michael knew the world was finally ready to hear. Ever since the photograph of Judith and the story of the unopened letter spread across the internet, Stanley Bernard's life had shifted in a way that felt both surreal and unbearable. For decades he had been invisible, a shadow tucked away in the Bowery shelter, surviving on weak coffee and the thin dignity of silence. But now strangers were appearing at the door asking for him, teachers writing letters, veterans sending folded notes of solidarity, and journalists hungry for headlines. Some wanted a story, some wanted closure, some wanted to claim a piece of him for themselves. Stanley, however, wanted none of it. He had spent 60 years shrinking from the spotlight, and the thought of becoming a symbol, of having his name turned into a headline, left him restless and uneasy. But the invitation to Arlington was different. The envelope came embossed with the seal of the United States, the kind of paper that carried the weight of generations. It was an official request for him to attend the National Memorial Day ceremony, to stand not as an icon, not as a celebrity, but as a witness. They asked if he would sing the Red Poppies of Monte Cassino. His first response was a flat refusal. He folded the letter neatly, set it aside, and muttered, "I don't need a stage. I've done my part." Yet Michael could see in his eyes that the resistance was not pride, but fear. Fear of being seen after so many years of hiding. Fear of opening his chest and letting the world glimpse the fragile heart he had kept guarded. That night they sat together by the small window of the shelter, the city lights flickering outside, the hum of traffic mingling with the hiss of the radiator. After a long silence, Michael spoke, not with persuasion, but with truth. "It's not about you, Stan. It's about Walter. It's about Judith. It's about all the men whose names are carved in stone, but whose voices are gone. If you sing, you're not singing for yourself, you're singing for them." The old man stared at him, his face caught between resistance and longing, and then, slowly, he nodded. Memorial Day 2005 dawned cool and gray, with clouds hanging low over Washington, D.C. The crowd gathered at Arlington National Cemetery was vast. Politicians, generals, veterans in wheelchairs, school children clutching small flags, families carrying photographs of the fallen. The air was thick with reverence and sorrow, a silence so profound that even the wind seemed hesitant to disturb it. When Stanley's name was called, Michael guided him to the podium. The old man's steps were slow, deliberate, his back bent but unbroken, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the lectern. For a moment, he simply looked out at the sea of faces, and then he leaned forward to the microphone and said with steady clarity, "I'm not here for myself. I'm here because I promised." And then he began to sing. The first notes were frail, wavering, as though pulled up from the deepest well of memory, but as the melody unfolded, his voice grew stronger, steadier, carrying over the crowd like a prayer woven into the air. The words of the Red Poppies of Monte Cassino rose above the silence, and in that moment it did not matter that the song had been born from Polish lips, for here it was an anthem of all who had bled on that mountain, American, British, Polish, and more, bound together by sacrifice. People rose to their feet, veterans saluted, mothers held their children closer. And as the chorus came, something extraordinary happened. Voices from the crowd began to join in. At first, it was a few, hesitant, uncertain of the foreign syllables, but then more, louder, until hundreds of voices were raised together, singing the song that had carried Stanley through the long years of loneliness. The melody became a river, sweeping across the cemetery, filling the air with remembrance. Stanley stopped singing for a moment, listening, tears cutting lines down his weathered face. For the first time in 60 years, he was not alone in his promise. When the song ended, there was no applause, only silence. A silence heavy with meaning, the kind that follows prayer, the kind that says more than clapping ever could. After the ceremony, reporters tried to press microphones into his face to capture a quote, a soundbite, but Stanley waved them away. "I've said what I needed to say," he murmured. Instead, he turned to Michael, placed a hand on his shoulder, and whispered words that carried all the weight of his life. "Now, it's yours." In the days that followed, newspapers across the country carried the story of the homeless veteran who sang a forgotten song and moved a nation. Some called him a symbol of resilience, others a reminder of the country's neglect of its own heroes. But for Stanley, none of that mattered. He had kept his vow. He had given Walter a voice, given Judith an answer, given the dead a song. That was enough. That night, back in the shelter, Stanley sat on the edge of his bed, the photograph of Judith propped on the table beside him. He smiled faintly, closed his eyes and whispered, "They sing it now. I don't have to anymore." And for the first time in decades, he lay down without humming. A few months after the Memorial Day ceremony, when the leaves of New York's trees had begun to turn and the air carried the first chill of autumn, Stanley Bernard passed away. It happened quietly, without struggle, in the same shelter on the Bowery where he had lived for so many years, surrounded not by family or fanfare, but by the dim light of a bedside lamp and the fragile dignity of stillness. He was found the next morning, his eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips, Judith's photograph in his hand, and a note on the table that read in shaky but unmistakable script, "Thank you for listening. Now you sing." This time, though, his passing was not invisible. There was no anonymous burial, no hurried ceremony, no unmarked grave. His death was carried in newspapers, spoken in classrooms, remembered in veterans' halls. And when his coffin was lowered into the ground at Calverton National Cemetery on Long Island, it was draped in the flag he had once fought under, accompanied by the mournful cry of a bugle, and honored by men and women who had never met him, but who came to stand witness because they knew his voice had carried theirs. Michael stood by the grave, his hands trembling as he read the words he had prepared. He did not speak of battles or medals, for those details were already carved in history books. Instead, he spoke of the man he had met in a shelter, the man who hummed when the world had turned away, the man who carried a promise through 60 silent years. He was invisible, Michael said, his voice breaking, until he sang, and in his song we heard not just him, but all the voices we had forgotten, and now we carry it forward. For Michael, the funeral was not an end, but a beginning. He launched a small project that soon became a foundation, the Stanley Bernard Foundation, dedicated to collecting the stories of forgotten veterans, preserving their letters, their diaries, their songs. Families began reaching out with boxes from attics, journals that had gathered dust, photographs that had never been shown. Slowly, a living archive grew, and Michael knew that every story he recorded was another note in the unfinished song Stanley had entrusted to him. Back at the shelter, a plaque was placed on the wall where Stanley had once sat. Nothing ornate, nothing polished, just wood and brass with a simple inscription. He sang for all of us, and now we sing for him. Beneath the words, etched into the metal, were the opening bars of the Red Poppies of Monte Cassino, the melody that had carried him through war, through silence, through invisibility. Michael often returned there, sitting in the same corner, closing his eyes and listening. Sometimes there was only silence. Sometimes he thought he could hear it still, faint, steady, a hum rising in the cold air, as though the song had never truly ended. Because memory, he had learned, does not die when a man's voice falls silent. Memory dies only when no one remembers to sing. And now others were singing. We bring you new stories every day, true stories that touch and inspire. Subscribe to our channel if you too believe that memory should never fall silent.